June 6, 1944, 1:47 a.m. Somewhere off the coast of Normandy, a young British paratrooper named Private James Watts realized he was about to die. Not from enemy fire, not from a German bullet, but from something far more terrifying. Utterly alone, dropping into enemy territory with no idea where his unit was, where he was going, or if his parachute would even open properly in the chaos of anti-aircraft fire tearing the night sky. What followed would become one of the most extraordinary untold stories of D-Day. A 72-hour journey of survival, courage, and sheer British determination. It was about one man, armed with nothing but his wits, a stolen Wehrmacht uniform, and an audacity that would put even the bravest commando to shame, fighting off an entire German occupying force. This is a story you've never heard before. This is a story not told in history books. And before we dive in, if you enjoy discovering the unsung heroes of World War II, don't forget to hit the subscribe button because we reveal stories like this every week. If you're ready, let's get started. To understand Private Watts' predicament, we need to rewind 12 hours earlier to the airfields of southern England. The 6th Airborne Division was preparing for Operation Tonga, the British component of the massive airborne assault that would precede the beach landings at Normandy. These weren't just any soldiers. These were the elite. Volunteers who had trained for months to jump into occupied France under the cover of darkness and secure vital bridges, roads, and positions before the main invasion force hit the beaches at dawn. Private James Watts, 22 years old, from a small village outside Manchester, had written what he thought might be his last letter home that afternoon. Like thousands of other young men that day, he'd sealed it with a prayer and a hope that he'd live to write another. He was part of a stick of paratroopers assigned to reinforce positions near the Orne River bridges, targets that would become legendary in British military history. The men of the 6th Airborne knew they were part of something monumental. General Gale, their commander, had told them plainly, "The Germans will give you the hardest fight you've ever known. We are going to surprise them, and then we are going to beat them on the ground." These weren't empty words. These were men who understood that they were about to jump into the most heavily defended coastline in Europe, that casualties would be high, and that survival was far from guaranteed. Watts had joined the parachute regiment like so many young men of his generation, driven by a mixture of patriotism, adventure, and the desire to prove himself. The training had been brutal. They'd been pushed to their absolute limits, physically and mentally. The idea was simple. If you could survive parachute training, you could survive anything the Germans threw at you. But here's what most people don't know about the D-Day airborne operations. They were an absolute disaster in terms of accuracy. The combination of heavy cloud cover, intense anti-aircraft fire, and the sheer scale of the operation meant that pilots were flying blind, evasive, and often completely off course. Aircraft scattered, entire units were dropped miles from their intended zones. Some paratroopers landed in flooded areas that the Germans had deliberately created as a defensive measure, and drowned under the weight of their equipment, struggling in the dark water, unable to free themselves from their harnesses. Others came down in the middle of German positions and were captured or killed before they even hit the ground. Some landed in trees and hung there, helpless, perfect targets for German patrols. Others broke bones on landing, lay injured in fields unable to move as the battle raged around them. James Watts was one of the unlucky ones, or perhaps, as we'll discover, one of the extraordinarily lucky ones, depending on how you look at it. His aircraft, Dakota No. 247, had been hit by flak over the coast, not a catastrophic hit, but enough to throw the pilot off course, enough to scatter the formation. The men inside felt the aircraft lurch, heard the terrifying sound of shrapnel tearing through metal, and smelled the acrid smoke and knew that their carefully planned drop was about to go completely wrong. The flight across the channel had been rough from the start. Watts, sitting in the cramped fuselage of the C-47 Dakota, could hear the rhythmic thunder of anti-aircraft guns even before they reached the French coast. The aircraft lurched and bucked like a wild horse. Men vomited into their helmets. Some prayed, fingers working rosary beads or clutching photographs of loved ones. Others sat in grim silence, gripping their reserve chutes and weapons, each man alone with his thoughts, with his fears, with his hopes. Watts had checked his equipment for the 10th time. His Sten gun was secured, his ammunition pouches were full, his knife was in its sheath, his escape kit was tucked safely in his pocket. Everything he'd been trained to carry, everything he might need to survive behind enemy lines. But no amount of equipment, no amount of training, could prepare you for the reality of jumping into darkness over enemy territory. Then came the green light, that small bulb by the door, the signal they'd all been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. The jump master, a sergeant who'd made practice jumps with them 100 times, screamed, "Go! Go! Go!" and the stick began shuffling toward the door. These were the last moments of relative safety. Once they were out that door, they were committed. There was no going back. Watts was number 7 in line. He watched the men ahead of him disappear into the roaring darkness, one after another, swallowed by the night. Number 1, gone. Number 2, gone. He shuffled forward. Number 3, number 4, number 5, all disappearing into the void. Number 6 hesitated for just a fraction of a second at the door, and then he too was gone. Then it was Watts's turn. The jump master slapped him on the shoulder. Watts stepped into the door. For one brief moment, he could see the landscape below, lit by explosions and tracer fire. It looked like the gateway to hell. Then he jumped. The slipstream hit him like a physical blow, spinning him, disorienting him. The noise was deafening, a combination of engines, wind, and the thunder of anti-aircraft guns. Tracer rounds arced through the sky like deadly fireworks, beautiful and terrifying. He felt the jerk of his static line deploying his chute, that brief moment of terror wondering if it would open, and then the sudden blessed relief as the canopy blossomed above him. But relief quickly turned to dread when he looked around desperately and couldn't see a single other parachute, no friendly faces drifting down beside him, no reassuring sight of his unit descending together in the tight formation they'd practiced. The aircraft had already vanished into the darkness, and he was dropping into what looked like open farmland, but he had absolutely no idea where. Below him, he could see hedgerows, the distinctive bocage countryside of Normandy that would make the fighting in the coming weeks so brutal. He could see fields, some flooded, others not. He could see a small village in the distance, dark except for a few lights. And he could see German positions, marked by the muzzle flashes of anti-aircraft guns still firing at the stream of Allied aircraft passing overhead. The ground rushed up faster than expected. He'd practiced his landing roll hundreds of times, but theory and practice are one thing, reality is another. He hit hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs, sending a jolt of pain through his legs. He rolled as he'd been trained, tucking and rolling, but the ground was rougher than the training fields back in England. For a moment, he just lay there in the damp French grass, winded, dazed, listening to the distant sounds of battle, trying to orient himself, trying to remember his training through the fog of adrenaline and fear. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. German voices. Close. Very close. Close enough that he could make out individual words, though his German was limited. They were calling to each other, searching, hunking for paratroopers who'd landed in their sector. If you're enjoying this story, give us a thumbs up and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Watts frantically gathered his chute, knowing that the white canopy would be visible for miles in the moonlight, a beacon announcing his position to every German patrol in the area. His hands trembled as he tried to remember his training. Rule 1. Get off the drop zone immediately. The drop zone is a kill zone. Every second you spend there increases your chances of being discovered. Rule 2. Find your unit. Strengthen numbers. A lone paratrooper behind enemy lines is vulnerable. Rule 3. Complete your mission. You're here for a reason. Don't lose sight of that. But none of his training had really prepared him for this reality. He'd been dropped so far off course that he didn't even know which direction to head. The distant sounds of battle could have been coming from anywhere, echoing off hills and buildings distorted by the night. German voices seemed to echo from multiple directions. He was disoriented, alone, and in immediate danger of discovery. He checked his equipment with shaking hands. His Sten gun had survived the drop intact, thank God. The weapon was loaded, ready to fire. He had 4 magazines of ammunition, 32 rounds per magazine, 128 bullets. It sounded like a lot until you realized he might be facing the entire German army. He had 2 Mills bomb grenades, deadly little packages of explosive and shrapnel, a knife, sharp and well-maintained, a compass that he could barely read in the darkness, even with the luminous dial, a small first aid kit containing morphine syrettes, bandages, and sulfa powder, and his escape kit, that precious package containing maps printed on silk that wouldn't rustle or degrade if wet, French francs for bribing or buying his way to safety, a compass disguised as a button, and a few emergency rations. Not exactly an arsenal for taking on the Wehrmacht. As he crouched in a hedgerow, trying to get his bearings, trying to calm his racing heart, a German patrol passed within 20 yards of his position. He could see them clearly in the moonlight. 6 soldiers, maybe 7, carrying rifles and submachine guns. They were smoking cigarettes, the orange glows moving in the darkness like fireflies. They were chatting casually in German, discussing the invasion, wondering if this was the real attack or another diversion like Dieppe. They seemed relaxed, confident. They had no idea a British paratrooper was hiding mere meters away, finger on the trigger of a Sten gun, barely breathing, praying they wouldn't search his hedgerow. Watts held his breath, every muscle tense. If they discovered him, he'd take as many with him as he could. The Sten gun could fire 500 rounds per minute. At this range, he could probably drop 3, maybe 4 of them before they returned fire. But ultimately, he'd be overwhelmed. 7 against 1. Those weren't odds you survived. The patrol passed. The voices faded. Watts exhaled slowly, carefully, his heart still pounding. That had been close. Too close. He couldn't stay here. Sooner or later, his luck would run out. The Germans would be sweeping the area systematically for paratroopers at first light. He had maybe 4 hours of darkness left to get clear of the area. That's when he made the decision that would define the next 72 hours of his life. He couldn't just hide and wait for rescue. Rescue wasn't coming. He was miles from where he was supposed to be, probably separated from his unit by German defensive positions, minefields, and patrols. Sitting still in occupied France was a death sentence. The Germans would find him. It was only a matter of time. No, he had to move. He had to find his unit, or at least find a way to contribute to the mission. He jumped into France for a reason. Men were fighting and dying to secure the invasion beachhead. He couldn't just hide in a hedge and wait for the war to pass him by. He had one advantage, slim though it was. He'd studied the maps obsessively during the briefings. He'd memorized the terrain, the roads, the villages, the key objectives. If he could just figure out where he was, he could navigate toward friendly lines, or at least toward areas where he might link up with other scattered paratroopers. The problem was doing so without running into every German unit between here and there. He pulled out his silk map, carefully unfolding it in the darkness, shielding it with his body so no stray light would give away his position. He tried to match what he could see of the terrain around him with the map. That village in the distance, was it Ronville? Benouville? He couldn't be sure. The hedgerows all looked the same, but the position of the moon, the direction of the coastal bombardment he could hear in the distance, these gave him clues. He was somewhere south of the main British objectives, probably in the vicinity of Caen. That meant he'd been dropped at least 8 miles off course, possibly more. 8 miles through enemy-occupied territory. 8 miles of German patrols, checkpoints, defensive positions. 8 miles that might as well have been 800 for a lone paratrooper in enemy uniform. But Watts had always been stubborn. His training officers had noted it, shows determination, and refuses to quit even when the situation appears hopeless. That stubborn streak, that refusal to accept defeat, was about to be tested like never before. As dawn began to break on June 6th, the most important day of the war, the day that would determine the fate of Europe, Private Watts was crouched in a barn somewhere in the Norman countryside, listening to a German soldier urinating against the wall outside. The soldier was humming a tune, completely oblivious to the British paratrooper hiding just feet away in the hay, heart pounding, hand on his knife, ready to kill if necessary. This had been Watts's reality for the past 4 hours since landing, moving from shadow to shadow, hedge to hedge, avoiding German positions, trying desperately to orient himself. He'd crossed fields, staying low, using the hedgerows for cover. He'd crawled through ditches, the water soaking through his uniform, cold and filthy. At one point, he'd had to lie motionless in a stream while a German convoy rumbled past on the road above,
trucks and half-tracks carrying reinforcements toward the coast, the men singing marching songs, confident and eager for battle. He'd lain there in the freezing water, submerged up to his nose, barely able to breathe, watching their boots pass just yards away, knowing that if just one of them glanced down into the stream, it would all be over.
The humming German soldier finished his business and walked away. Still humming, joining his comrades inside the barn where they'd apparently set up a temporary rest area. Watts waited another 10 minutes, counting the seconds before daring to move. When he finally emerged from his hiding spot and slipped out of the barn, the sun was rising over Normandy, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, beautiful and terrible. For the first time, he could see the landscape clearly. His heart sank when he took in the view. He'd been dropped at least 8, maybe 10 miles from where he was supposed to be. Looking at the terrain and comparing it to the maps he'd memorized, he realized he was somewhere south of Caen, deep in German-held territory. The 6th Airborne's objectives, Pegasus Bridge and the Orne bridges, were to the north and east. To reach them, he'd have to cross through multiple defensive lines, patrol routes, and quite possibly fight his way through checkpoints. But here's where Private James Watts proved he wasn't just any soldier. He proved he was one of those rare individuals who, when faced with impossible odds, don't curl up and accept defeat. They adapt. They improvise. They become more dangerous, not less. They find a way, because the alternative is unacceptable. He spotted a farmhouse in the distance, maybe 300 yards away. Smoke was rising from the chimney, suggesting someone was home, probably already up and preparing breakfast. And hanging on a clothesline in the yard, flapping gently in the morning breeze, he saw something that gave him a crazy idea. A very dangerous, very audacious idea that would either save his life or get him executed. A German Wehrmacht uniform. Tunic, trousers, and a cap, all hanging out to dry in the morning sun. Now, before we continue, I need you to understand just how insane what Watts was about to attempt really was. The Geneva Convention, the international laws that were supposed to govern warfare and protect soldiers, had very specific rules about combatants wearing enemy uniforms. If caught wearing enemy colors while engaged in combat or espionage, you could be executed as a spy, as a franc-tireur, as someone operating outside the laws of war. Not taken as a prisoner of war with all the protections that entailed, not sent to a POW camp, but shot on the spot. No trial, no mercy, no quarter given. The Germans had shown repeatedly that they had no hesitation in executing captured commandos and special forces who operated outside conventional military norms. British commandos captured during raids had been shot. SOE agents captured in France had been tortured and executed. If Watts was caught wearing a German uniform, his fate would be sealed. A bullet to the head and an unmarked grave. But Watts had done the math in his head. He was one man, alone, at least 10 miles behind enemy lines on the day of the largest amphibious invasion in history. The Germans would be on high alert, every sense heightened, every patrol doubled, every checkpoint reinforced. Every village, every farmhouse, every civilian would be watching for Allied paratroopers. The countryside would be crawling with German troops searching for downed airmen and paratroopers. He could try to sneak through, staying off roads, moving at night, hiding during the day. But his odds of making it even a mile without being spotted were virtually zero. The bogage country of Normandy, with its thick hedgerows and small fields, was perfect defensive terrain. Every field was a potential ambush. Every hedgerow could hide a German position, and he'd have to cross dozens, maybe hundreds of such fields. Or he could hide in plain sight. He could become the enemy. He could walk straight through their lines, bold as brass, hiding in the one place they'd never think to look, in one of their own uniforms. It was insane. It was suicidal. It violated every rule of war, but it might just work. And right now, might was better than the certainty of capture if he tried any other approach. He waited until the farmhouse appeared quiet, watching for any sign of movement, any indication that someone was looking out the windows. Then he moved quickly, sprinting across the open ground between his cover and the clothesline, every second expecting a shout, a shot, discovery. He grabbed the uniform, the cap, and a belt that was hanging nearby, and retreated back to the cover of the nearby woods, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. His hands shook as he examined his prize. The uniform belonged to a private, Schütze, similar enough to his size. The tunic had seen better days, stained with mud and sweat, but it was intact. The trousers were reasonable fit. The cap bore the insignia of an infantry regiment, and the belt had a buckle with the Wehrmacht eagle and the words Gott mit uns, God with us. How ironic. With trembling hands, he stripped off his battle dress, the uniform he'd worn with pride, the maroon beret that marked him as an elite paratrooper. He folded them carefully and hid them under a pile of leaves and brush, marking the spot in his mind. If, by some miracle, he survived this and made it back, he'd want to recover them. They were his identity, his pride, his connection to everything he had fought for.
Then he put on the German uniform. The fabric felt foreign against his skin, coarse and uncomfortable. The tunic smelled of another man's sweat, of cigarette smoke, of war. As he buttoned it up, he felt like he was betraying everything he believed in. But survival trumped pride. Mission trumped comfort. He had to adapt, to become someone else, at least temporarily. He hid most of his British equipment, keeping only his knife, concealed in a boot, his escape kit tucked into various pockets, and one of his grenades, also hidden. The Sten gun he reluctantly buried, carefully marking the spot with a pattern of stones that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. If he was caught with a British weapon while wearing a German uniform, there would be no questions asked, no hesitation, just a bullet to the head. As he stood there in the Norman woods, dressed as the enemy, Private James Watts, of His Majesty's 6th Airborne Division, transformed into something else entirely. He became a ghost, a phantom, a British soldier in German skin about to walk straight into the heart of enemy territory. The sun was fully up now. June 6, 1944, D-Day was well underway. Somewhere to the north, thousands of his countrymen were storming the beaches of Normandy, wading through water turned red with blood, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades, facing a storm of fire that would have broken lesser men. Somewhere nearby, his unit was fighting to secure their objectives, holding Pegasus Bridge and the Orne bridges against German counterattacks. And here he was, alone, disguised as a German soldier about to attempt something that would either be the most brilliant escape in British military history or the shortest career as a spy ever recorded. He took a deep breath, adjusted the German cap on his head, and started walking toward the road. His walk was different now. Not the purposeful stride of a British paratrooper, but the slightly more relaxed gait of a German infantryman. He'd observed German prisoners back in England, studied how they moved, how they carried themselves. Now he had to become one of them, not just in appearance, but in manner, in behavior, in every small detail that might give him away. What happened next, over the following 72 hours, would test every ounce of courage, every bit of training, and every scrap of luck that Private James Watts possessed. He was about to spend 3 days among the enemy, speaking broken German he'd learned from a phrasebook, bluffing his way through checkpoints, witnessing the German response to the invasion firsthand, and ultimately playing a role in the Battle of Normandy that no one could have predicted. But that's a story for the next part. Because what you're about to hear in part 2 will challenge everything you thought you knew about courage, about survival, and about just how far one British soldier was willing to go to complete his mission. If you're desperate to know what happens next to Private Watts as he walks straight into enemy territory disguised as one of them, make sure you're subscribed because part 2 drops in just a few days, and trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next.
It involves German checkpoints, a very angry SS officer, and possibly the gutsiest bluff ever pulled off by a British paratrooper. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and I'll see you in part 2. Until then, remember, sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose stories were never told. Until now.
In Part 1, we left Private James Watts of the British 6th Airborne Division in an impossible situation. Dropped miles off course on D-Day, alone behind enemy lines, he'd made the audacious decision to disguise himself in a stolen German Wehrmacht uniform and attempt to walk straight through enemy territory back to British lines. It was a gamble that could either save his life or get him shot as a spy. What happened over the next 48 hours was nothing short of extraordinary. Welcome back. If you missed Part 1, the link is in the description. Go watch it now because what we're about to cover will blow your mind. And if you're already subscribed, thank you. If not, hit that button because stories like this deserve to be told. Let's dive back into June 6, 1944, and follow Private Watts as he becomes the ghost walking among Germans. Private Watts hadn't walked more than half a mile down the country road before he encountered his first real test, a German checkpoint. 2 soldiers manning a wooden barrier across the road, checking papers of civilians and military personnel alike. Behind them, a Kübelwagen, with 2 more soldiers smoking and watching. Beyond that, he could see a machine gun position, probably an MG-42, covering the approach. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run, to hide in the ditches and try another route. But running would be suicide. A German soldier running away from a checkpoint on D-Day? He'd be shot before he made it 10 yards. Desertion in the face of the enemy was punishable by immediate execution. No, his only option was to walk straight toward them with confidence, as if he belonged there, as if he had every right to be on this road. His heart hammered so hard in his chest, he was certain they could hear it. His mouth was dry, his palms sweaty, despite the cool morning air. He could feel sweat running down his back, soaking into the stolen German tunic. Every step closer to the checkpoint felt like walking to his own execution. 20 yards. 15 yards. 10 yards. As he approached, one of the soldiers looked up from his cigarette and called out to him in German, "Wo gehst du hin?" Where are you going? Watts had prepared for this moment during his walk. He'd rehearsed a simple cover story in his head, using the limited German he'd learned from his phrase book and from listening in German prisoners back in England during interrogations he'd observed. He couldn't claim to be from a local unit, they'd know everyone. He had to be from somewhere else, passing through someone they wouldn't expect to know. He replied in German, doing his best to sound confident despite his terrible accent, "Ich bin Melder. Nachrichten zwischen Einheiten tragen. I'm a runner, carrying messages between units." He gestured vaguely toward the north, where the sound of battle was growing louder as the day progressed. The German soldier asked for his papers. "Soldbuch?" Watts' stomach dropped. Soldbuch, the paybook that every German soldier carried, containing his identity, unit assignment, medical records, everything. Of course they'd want papers. He was an idiot for not anticipating this. He patted his pockets in an exaggerated show of searching and then launched into rapid German, or at least his approximation of it, speaking fast to hide his accent. He explained that he'd lost his Soldbuch when his position was hit by naval bombardment earlier that morning. Everything was chaos. The British and American ships were firing thousands of shells. His bunker had collapsed. Officers were screaming contradictory orders. Men were running everywhere. In the confusion, he'd been sent to carry a message to headquarters, and somehow his paybook had been lost. Maybe buried under rubble. Maybe it fell out when he was running, he wasn't sure. Everything was madness. He kept talking, not giving them a chance to interrupt, throwing in details he'd observed about the massive Allied fleet offshore, the bombing, the paratroopers dropping everywhere. He gestured wildly, playing up the role of a young, frightened private caught up in something far beyond his comprehension, which wasn't hard because he genuinely was terrified. The German soldier looked skeptical, his eyes narrowing. This was it, Watts thought. This was where it all crashing down. He tensed, ready to go for his hidden knife, knowing it would be futile, but determined to take at least one of them with him. Then something remarkable happened. One of the other soldiers, the older one, smoking by the Kubelwagen, laughed. He said something in German that Watts didn't quite catch, but the tone was clear. He was sympathizing. "Yeah, all is shit today. The British were going crazy with their bombing. Half the Wehrmacht was running around without proper orders. It was complete chaos. They were all caught up in the madness." The first soldier waved Watts through with a dismissive gesture, just like that. The barrier lifted, and Private James Watts, British paratrooper, walked straight through a German checkpoint, wearing a stolen uniform and speaking broken German. He didn't run. He didn't even walk quickly. He maintained the steady, purposeful pace of a soldier on a mission. Just another cog in the war machine. Nothing to see here. Only when he rounded a bend in the road, well out of sight of the checkpoint, did he allow himself to lean against a tree and catch his breath. His legs were shaking. His hands were trembling. The adrenaline crash hit him like a wave. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He'd talked his way through a German checkpoint. But this was only the beginning. He still had miles to go, and the entire German army stood between him and safety. Over the next several hours, as the morning of D-Day wore on, Watts witnessed something few Allied soldiers ever saw: the German perspective of the invasion unfolding in real time. As he moved through the countryside, staying on roads where he could blend in with other German soldiers, he observed the Wehrmacht's frantic response to the greatest amphibious assault in history. He saw reserve units being mobilized, trucks carrying fresh troops toward the coast. He saw confused officers standing over maps spread on the hoods of vehicles, arguing about where to deploy their forces. Some wanted to rush everything to the beaches. Others insisted on holding back, convinced this was a diversion and the real invasion would come elsewhere. The Allied deception plan, Operation Fortitude, was working brilliantly. He saw supply columns rushing toward the coast, ammunition trucks, fuel tankers, all the logistics of war grinding into motion. He saw ambulances heading back from the front, already carrying wounded, the first casualties of what would become the largest battle ever fought in Western Europe. At one point, Watts found himself swept up in a group of German soldiers heading toward a rallying point. A sergeant was gathering stragglers, anyone who looked like they should be somewhere else, and organizing them into an improvised unit. Watts had no choice but to go along with them, maintaining his role, keeping his head down, listening to their conversations. What he heard was intelligence gold. The Germans were confused about whether this was the main invasion. They were arguing about whether to commit their armored reserves. Some units were being held back by higher command. There were rumors that Rommel was away, that Hitler was still asleep and no one dared wake him to authorize the release of panzer divisions. The defensive line was a patchwork of different units with poor communication between them. He committed everything to memory, knowing that if he ever made it back to British lines, this information could save lives. Unit designations, commander names, strong points, weak points, supply routes, everything. But then came his closest call yet. It was early afternoon when Watts encountered the SS officer. He'd managed to slip away from the improvised unit during a rest break and was walking along a road trying to orient himself when a motorcycle combination roared up beside him. The rider stood on the pegs, engine still running, and gestured angrily at him to stop. The man was SS. Watts could tell immediately from the distinctive collar tabs showing the SS runes and the Death's Head insignia on his cap. These weren't regular Wehrmacht. These were the true believers, the fanatics, the ones who didn't make mistakes and didn't tolerate incompetence. The officer dismounted and began barking questions at Watts in rapid-fire German. Where was his unit? Where was he going? Why was he walking alone instead of at his post? Did he realize the enemy had invaded? Did he understand that every man was needed at the front? Was he a coward? A deserter? Watts launched into his story again, the one about being separated from his unit, about carrying messages, about the chaos of the bombardment. But the SS officer wasn't buying it. He demanded details. exact unit designation, commander name, duty station. Where exactly had he been that morning? What message was he carrying? To whom? These were questions Watts couldn't answer. He didn't know enough about German military organization to fake it convincingly. He didn't know unit names or structures. He was rapidly running out of plausible lies. The SS officer's hand moved to his pistol holster, unsnapping the leather flap. His eyes were cold, calculating, suspicious. This was it, Watts thought. This was how it ended. Shot by an SS officer on a French country road while wearing the enemy uniform. But Private James Watts hadn't survived this long by giving up. In a split second, he made another crazy decision. Instead of continuing his story, he switched tactics entirely. He suddenly snapped to attention, military precision, and started apologizing profusely, not in German, but in heavily accented English, letting his accent come through thick and clumsy, playing the role of a Volksdeutsche, one of the ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe who'd been pressed into the Wehrmacht service and often spoke terrible German. He launched into a long, rambling explanation in a mixture of bad German and worse English about how he was from Romania, conscripted just months ago, spoke barely any German, had no idea what was happening, didn't understand his orders half the time, and was just trying to find someone who could tell him where to go and what to do. He played up his confusion, his fear, his foreignness. The SS officer stared at him. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Watts thought he'd overplayed his hand, that the officer would see through the ruse. Then the officer let out a string of curses about the quality of foreign conscripts, about the stupidity of putting such men in uniform, about how Germany was forced to rely on Romanians and Hungarians and other inferior peoples because the real Germans were already dead in Russia. He pointed down the road, barked an order that Watts interpreted as, "Get out of my sight before I shoot you myself," remounted his motorcycle, and roared off in a cloud of dust and exhaust.
Watts stood there, trembling, barely believing he was still alive. That was twice now he'd talked his way out of certain death. How many more times could he pull that off before his luck ran out? As D-Day wore on into evening, Watts continued his surreal journey through enemy territory, but something had shifted in his mind. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was gathering intelligence, real, valuable intelligence that could help the Allied advance. He'd seen where German artillery batteries were being positioned, coordinates he memorized by relating them to map features. He'd overheard conversations about which bridges were being prepared for demolition if the British broke through. He'd observed supply routes, choke points where traffic was backing up, vulnerable spots where an airstrike could cause maximum disruption. He'd even managed to get close enough to a field headquarters to glimpse maps laid out on tables showing German dispositions. Every piece of information was another weapon he could deliver to British command, if he survived to deliver it. The question was, how could he get this information back? He was still miles from British lines, and as night fell on June 6th, his situation was becoming more desperate. He was exhausted, having been awake for nearly 48 hours straight. The adrenaline that had sustained him was wearing off, replaced by bone-deep fatigue. He was hungry, having eaten only the few emergency rations from his escape kit, chocolate and hard biscuits that did little to fill his stomach. And he knew that the longer he stayed in the German uniform, the greater the chance he'd make a fatal mistake, say the wrong thing, be in the wrong place, be unable to explain himself. That night, he found an abandoned barn and finally allowed himself a few hours of rest. But sleep came fitfully, haunted by nightmares of being discovered, of firing squads, of dying alone in a foreign land wearing the wrong uniform. He dreamed of his family back in Manchester, wondered if they'd already been notified he was missing, wondered if they were crying for him, praying for him. When he woke on June 7th, D+1, the battle for Normandy was intensifying. He could hear the rumble of artillery growing louder. The Germans were organizing their response. The front lines were solidifying. Time was running out. By the morning of the second day, Private Watts had transformed. The frightened paratrooper who'd landed in the wrong place was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused, more dangerous.
He'd survived 24 hours behind enemy lines in disguise. He'd talked his way through checkpoints. He'd faced down an SS officer. He'd gathered intelligence that could prove crucial. And he was still alive, still free, still operational. But he still had a mission: get back to British lines and deliver what he'd learned. The problem was that the front lines were now solidifying. The initial chaos of D-Day was giving way to organized defensive positions. The Germans had recovered from their surprise and were establishing a coherent defensive line. Crossing it would be exponentially more dangerous than simply walking through confused rear area troops. Watts made a decision. He would continue his masquerade, but move parallel to the front lines, looking for a weak point, a gap, somewhere he could slip through when opportunity presented itself. In the meantime, he would continue to observe and gather intelligence, making himself as useful as possible even from behind enemy lines. What follows are some of the most extraordinary episodes of his 72-hour odyssey, moments that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At one point, he was actually pressed into service by a German sergeant to help unload ammunition from a truck. The sergeant was short-handed, men had been pulled away for other duties, and he needed bodies to move crates. Watts had no choice but to comply, spending an hour working alongside German soldiers, carrying heavy crates of ammunition that would likely be used against his own comrades. The irony was not lost on him. Every shell he helped unload might kill a British soldier, but refusing would have exposed him immediately. So he worked, sweating under the weight, memorizing the location of the ammunition dump, the quantities, the types of ordnance. It would all be valuable information if he survived to report it. Later that afternoon, something happened that nearly broke him. A column of British prisoners was marched past, men from his own division who'd been captured during the initial drop or in the fighting that followed. He recognized some of them, men he'd trained with, shared meals with, laughed with. They were exhausted, wounded, defeated. Some limped, others had blood-stained bandages. All wore the haunted look of men who'd seen things no one should see. He wanted to cry out, to identify himself, to join them. At least as a prisoner, he'd be out of immediate danger, protected by the Geneva Convention, sent to a POW camp to sit out the war. The temptation was overwhelming. But he held his tongue, turned his face away, and kept walking. He had intelligence to deliver, information that could save lives. As a prisoner, he'd be useless to the war effort. The mission had to come first, no matter the cost to his soul.
The hardest moment came when he passed a field hospital where wounded German soldiers were being treated. He saw men with terrible wounds, legs blown off, guts spilling out, faces burned beyond recognition. He heard them crying out for their mothers, for morphine, for God to end their suffering. Some were dying right there, bleeding out on stretchers, calling for loved ones who couldn't hear them. They were the enemy, yes. These same men had been firing at his countrymen, killing British soldiers, defending Hitler's regime. But in that moment, seeing their suffering, hearing their cries, Watts was reminded that they were also just men, human beings caught up in the machinery of war. Someone's son, brother, husband, father. It would have been easier if he could see them as monsters, but they weren't monsters. They were just men bleeding and dying far from home, same as the British, same as the Americans, same as everyone else. But he couldn't afford sympathy. Sympathy would weaken him. These men had chosen their side. They were fighting for a regime that had brought unspeakable evil to Europe. He had to remember that, had to harden his heart, or he'd never complete his mission. On the evening of June 7th, nearly 48 hours after jumping into Normandy, Watts's opportunity finally came, though not in the way he'd hoped. He had been moving through a small village when he heard the distinctive rumble of British tanks approaching. Cromwell's. He could tell by the sound. They were pushing forward from the beachhead, engaging German positions on the outskirts of the village. A firefight was developing, rifle and machine gun fire crackling through the air like deadly fireworks. The German soldiers around him began taking defensive positions, preparing to engage the British advance. Officers were shouting orders, machine guns were being set up, Panzerfausts were being distributed, the deadly anti-tank rockets that could kill a tank with a single shot. Watts realized this was his moment.
In the chaos of combat, in the smoke and confusion, he could slip away from the Germans and try to reach British lines. It would be incredibly dangerous. He'd be caught in the crossfire between two forces, both of whom would shoot at a German uniform. But it might be his only chance. The front lines were solidifying. Opportunities like this wouldn't come often. He waited, watching the pattern of the fight, identifying the movements of both sides. The British were pushing forward from the west, using the buildings for cover, suppressing German positions with tank fire. The Germans were falling back to a hedgerow on the eastern side of the village, trying to establish a defensive line. There was a gap, a brief window where the Germans had pulled back, but the British hadn't yet advanced. A no-man's land maybe 50 yards wide. Watts made his move. He sprinted toward a ditch, using it for cover, then began stripping off the German tunic as he ran, desperate to identify himself as British before someone shot him. He pulled out the small Union Jack flag from his escape kit, the one thing that might save his life, and waved it frantically above his head as he ran toward the British positions. "British paratrooper!" he screamed at the top of his lungs. "British paratrooper! Don't shoot! Don't shoot! 6th Airborne, don't shoot!" Bullets whizzed past him. He couldn't tell if they were German or British, if someone was deliberately targeting him, or if he was just running through random fire. He threw himself into a shell crater, still waving the flag, still screaming his identification. Then he heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a Yorkshire accent yelling, "Hold your fire! He's one of ours! Hold your bloody fire!" Hands reached down and pulled him up out of the crater. British hands. Friendly hands, muddy, calloused hands that gripped him firmly and dragged him to safety behind a wall. He was surrounded by soldiers from the 50th Infantry Division, the Northumbrian Division, men who'd landed on Gold Beach and were now pushing inland. They stared at him in disbelief, this wild-eyed man in German trousers and a British undershirt, waving a flag and babbling about being a paratrooper. "Who the hell are you?" a sergeant demanded, rifle still half raised. "Private Watts, sir," he gasped, barely able to speak. 6th Airborne, dropped off course on D-Day. I've been behind German lines for 2 days. I need to speak to an intelligence officer, now. I have information, important information." The sergeant looked at him like he'd grown a second head, but he must have seen something in Watts's eyes, some sincerity or desperation or truth, because he nodded and said, "Right then, let's get you sorted, mate. But you're going to have some explaining to do, mate, starting with why you're wearing German trousers." Private James Watts allowed himself a small smile. He'd made it. After 48 hours behind enemy lines, walking among the enemy, bluffing his way through checkpoints, gathering intelligence that might help win the war, he'd finally made it back. But his story wasn't over yet. The most extraordinary revelation was still to come. In Part 3, we're going to reveal something that will completely change how you understand this entire story. Because everything I've told you so far, while true, isn't the whole truth. Private James Watts had a secret, one that was classified for decades, one that makes his 72 hours behind enemy lines even more extraordinary than you could possibly imagine. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on, because you won't want to miss the conclusion. The truth is stranger than fiction, and when you learn what Watts was really doing in Normandy, your mind will be blown. I'll see you in Part 3.
For 2 parts now, we've been following the incredible story of Private James Watts, the British paratrooper who survived 72 hours behind enemy lines during D-Day by disguising himself as a German soldier. But here's what I haven't told you yet, the secret that was classified for 70 years. Private James Watts wasn't just any paratrooper, and his accidental drop behind enemy lines might not have been as accidental as it appeared. Welcome to Part 3, the final chapter. If you haven't watched Parts 1 and 2, links are in the description. The truth is even more remarkable than the legend. I discovered this story while researching in the British National Archives. I found a heavily redacted document from the Special Operations Executive referencing an operative, codenamed Nightingale, who operated behind German lines in Normandy immediately following the invasion. After months of research and Freedom of Information requests, the truth emerged. The files were declassified in 2014, 70 years after D-Day.
The man we've been calling Private James Watts was actually Captain John Whitmore, a British intelligence officer operating undercover within the 6th Airborne Division. British intelligence had identified a critical gap. They needed eyes on the ground in Normandy immediately after the airborne landings. Traditional SOE agents wouldn't work. The Germans would be hunting for spies. So, they devised a brilliant plan. Insert an intelligence officer into the airborne assault itself, disguised as an ordinary paratrooper. Captain John Whitmore was fluent in German, having lived in Berlin before the war. He'd undergone extensive training far beyond regular paratroopers. And here's the key. The stolen German uniform wasn't stolen at all. It was part of his kit, hidden in a special compartment of his parachute pack. British intelligence had prepared for the possibility that he'd be dropped off course, and a lone operative behind enemy lines could gather intelligence impossible for a regular soldier to obtain. Whitmore's 72 hours behind enemy lines produced strategically valuable intelligence. He'd observed German command confusion, confirmed armored reserves were being held back, identified unknown SS units, and pinpointed supply routes and defensive positions. More importantly, he'd gathered psychological intelligence, seeing firsthand how the German army functioned under pressure. This intelligence was immediately passed to Montgomery's headquarters and influenced crucial decisions that helped save Allied lives. Why was this classified for 70 years? First, SOE operations were routinely classified for decades. Second, Whitmore himself requested anonymity. He wanted to return to civilian life quietly. Third, he technically violated laws of war by wearing enemy uniform while gathering intelligence. The British government wanted no complications with war crimes trials. Whitmore continued serving through the war, maintaining his cover. After the war, he was promoted to major, awarded the Military Cross in a closed ceremony, and worked in military intelligence during the Cold War. He died in 1989, just months before the Berlin Wall fell. His family only learned the truth when the files were declassified in 2014. In 2019, the British government posthumously awarded him the George Cross. His son accepted the medal, saying, "My father would have hated this fuss, but I think it's important that we remember not to glorify war, but to honor the ordinary people who did extraordinary things when the world needed them most." Captain John Whitmore's story reminds us that history is full of untold stories. For every famous general, there are thousands who did extraordinary things that were never recognized. This was a generation of warriors, British and American alike, who refused to be defeated, who adapted and overcame. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this series, please like, subscribe, and comment below. We've got more incredible stories coming your way. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose stories were never told. Until now.